Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. One last story here of Washington versus business, and it involves Bernie Sanders, the senator who is now the chairman of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. And he had threatened a few weeks ago to subpoena CEOs of drug companies, pharmaceutical companies, to come in and testify about what he called the outrageously high price of prescription drugs. Recently, those pharma CEO have agreed to come in voluntarily without a subpoena. Let us listen to a clip of Bernie Sanders recently talking about this.
There is a lot of discussion in our country as to how divided we are as a people. And there's obviously a lot of truth in that. On many, many issues, there is a deep division in our country. But I got to tell you that on one of the most important matters facing our country, the American people, whether they're Democrats, Republicans, independents, conservatives, progressives, whatever, they could not be more united. And that is the need to take on the extraordinary greed of the pharmaceutical industry and to substantially lower the outrageously high cost of prescription drugs in America. On that, the American people are united.
Alicia, one piece of the Journal's editorial on this that caught my eye was that the drug companies had agreed to send pricing experts to go talk to this Senate committee, and Bernie Sanders really wants the CEOs. What's going on here?
He wants to essentially beat up the CEOs, lash them. So Merck and Johnson & Johnson both agreed to send executives who have a high-level knowledge of how companies set their prices in both Europe and in the U.S., which is the purported subject of the hearing. Now, Johnson & Johnson also mentioned in its letter, its initial response to Bernie Sanders, that actually a lot of the drugs, the Johnson & Johnson itself doesn't control the European prices for a lot of these drugs that are licensed. So he's actually asking the wrong questions. But in any case, what he really just wants to do is bully these CEOs because Merck and Johnson were two of the companies that have challenged the Inflation Reduction Act's drug price controls. And these drug price controls, the Democrats and Sanders call them Medicare, quote unquote, negotiations, but these aren't negotiations. Essentially, the government, the CMS right now, is actually in the process. Tomorrow, it's supposed to provide its initial, quote unquote, offer. But the drug companies, they're not allowed to reject these offers because then they'd be subject to essentially an excise tax that rises to around 1,900% of their daily revenues if they reject the government's offer or refuse to participate in the quote-unquote negotiations. And so they basically have a gun to their head either way. So Merck, Johnson, Bristol Myers Squibb, and actually a handful of other pharma companies or industry groups, he's essentially just trying to make examples. This is what you guys get for suing and challenging us. And he's called other CEOs before the Health Committee. He threatened to subpoena the Starbucks CEO, Howard Schultz, who belatedly, again, he actually agreed to testify. The Moderna CEO did. And it's not a pleasant experience, but I think the companies believe it's worse PR to not testify than to come before the committee and just get berated by Bernie Sanders, because I think at the end of the day, most people realize Bernie Sanders is a little crazy.
Kim, we'll give you the last word, but this story of senators berating business leaders is not a new one. The story of a White House trying to block business acquisitions is not a new one. Tell me if I'm wrong, though, that one thing it seems to me that maybe has changed in recent years is there's more Republican division on this than there used to be. Fewer people than there used to be, like Senator Pat Toomey, who was really comfortable standing up and defending the working of free markets. And I would point to this acquisition of U.S. Steel by the Japanese company Nippon that is currently pending. And there are at least 3 Republican senators, I think, who have come out against this, arguing that it is against U.S. national security interests, which to my mind, is more of a populist pose than a real argument on the merits.
I think Alicia is being very kind and only calling Bernie Sanders crazy. I would use other words, disgraceful, a bit appalling, especially because when you're talking about prescription drugs, you're talking about people's lives. And the fact that he hasn't bothered or isn't willing to understand how markets work and the extraordinary innovations that have become possible because of the pharmaceutical and biotech industry, people who are alive today because of that, he wants to impose price controls that would fundamentally disrupt that. And the consequences of that would actually be deadly. But I agree with you. The really concerning turn in Washington is Republicans who have clambered aboard what I would call this kind of race by Washington politicians to cater to what they think is the working man vote, the left behind, the forgotten person. I find that a bit bizarre because I doubt most of them have met anybody like that. Most conservative voters I know, especially small business owners, the white working class, if that's who they're catering to, they believe in free markets. They believe in government staying out of their lives. But they think that there is some populist benefit in railing on Wall Street and wealthy people. And I think the business community, I would just note this, has not helped its cause at all by showing no backbone in recent years on woke issues, for instance, and the whole DEI culture for increasingly coming to Washington with their hand out for subsidies. And, that gives them a bad look. And, the Chamber of Commerce, for instance, really, really upset Republicans a few years ago when it was attempting to look all bipartisan and actually gave endorsements and support for Democrats that have voted almost a pure anti-business agenda in the House. And so there's been some rifts. I think that there needs to be some work done on both sides to try to heal that, because business needs to understand that it needs one party in Washington that is going to go to the mat for it, but it's going to have to get up and stand up and defend free markets first if it wants that kind of support from politicians as well.
Thank you, Kim and Alicia. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.